Hi, it's Dr. Scott. I thought I would do something really different this time. I'm going to try posting a video after having read your journals about Hedwig instead of posting a journal or posting a video that I made before reading your journals. And I have sort of three takeaways that I want to share with you, all based on reading and reacting to what you wrote. One has to do with what has changed radically since the play was written. Another has to do with what has not changed, alas, radically since the play was written. And there's actually two parts of that. So that's part two and part three. What has changed, I think, is our awareness of the Berlin Wall. I was really happy that so many of you were able to grasp the emotional power of that wall as a metaphor. Although since so many of you were born, virtually all of you, were born after the wall fell in 1989, I just wanted to say that for somebody, again, of my generation, that wall was just loomed over our entire consciousness. I was struggling to think of something that looms over our consciousness as completely today. The fact that that wall just tumbled so suddenly and vanished in like a space of a couple of months would be as if suddenly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the walls between them vanished magically in a couple of months, or suddenly North Korea and South Korea, the demilitarized zone that's been between them for more than 50 years, vanished. And suddenly this conflict that's about to blow up the planet just wasn't there anymore. I even have a piece of the Berlin Wall in my office. That's why I'm filming this in my office. Here it is. I think you can see maybe the words Berlin on here. I bought this in the early 90s when I went to Berlin because you still can, pieces of the wall. So this is this otherwise ugly and nondescript piece of concrete. You can even see some yellow on the top from graffiti. And this was literally a piece of that wall. And it's in my hand, in my office, in my heart, because for those of my generations, the fact that this wall was shattered was huge. And yes, it's just as huge as, let's say, the fact that now we have legalized gay marriage in all 50 states, and so on and so forth. And that, by the way, leads me to the second part of my speech, which is, although I do think that things have changed radically politically, both in terms of East-West relations, but also in terms of gender relations and LGBTQ rights, I don't want us to over-congratulate ourselves. And so, once again, I was really thrilled that at least one of you was pointing out that the rates of violence against transgender people now, today, in 2018, are still off the charts and far worse than the already alarming rates of violence and oppression and job discrimination and every other category of hate that afflict the L and the G and the B part of our LGBTQ plus communities. So routinely, transgender people suffer physical violence. Routinely, they are fired from their jobs. Routinely, many of the job protections, many of this sort of like the life protections that I take for granted as an openly gay guy in the Bay Area don't apply to my transgender friends. And I need to be aware of that, but you need to be aware of it also, regardless of whether you have friends, colleagues, family members in the transgender community or not. You need to recognize that it hasn't changed as much as it should have. And this leads me to my third point about what has not changed. It was great that so many of you were referencing David Bowie and glam rock and all this stuff. And of course, we have a big sort of like Queen retrospective tour and all of that kind of cross-dressing, super drag queen part of the history of rock and roll is getting all sorts of kind of glamorized, Broadwayized, even Disney-fied attention. But I have to say, from my perspective, as somebody who was in the music business, I still don't think that rock and roll has fully owned how much of the history of rock and roll was created by trans people, drag queens, people with people with non-standard gender identities, or who celebrated their weirdness. I guess I can embrace that word because they did. So even now, when their music is legendary, I'm still not convinced that the role of the trans community in the birth of rock and roll is as fully acknowledged as it should be, in the same way that we still struggle with acknowledging the role of African American music in the birth of rock and roll, because they are inseparable. They are inseparable. And that, I think, is where Hedwig and the End Ranch remains radical and ahead of its time, not some 20-year-old relic that we can polish off and say, oh, wasn't that cute, and now we're so much wiser now. But tell me what you think about this in your essays, your essay test this week.